Hi everybody, welcome. Welcome to a grand and exciting story this time. Very dramatic, very, well, fearful in some ways and very exhilarating in other ways. It's a story about a chosen people, and it's a story about faith, it's a story about deliverance, and it's a story about courage, and it's a story about a man called Moses. But rather than tell you all about it now, let's tell the story. And the story is going to start in the promised land of Canaan. Canaan was where the chosen people lived. They were told by God that this was their place. And so they lived there quite well until a drought came along. It was a terrible, terrible drought. And what it did is it turned all the land around into a desert. Was there any food? No. There was no water, no rain, lots of heat, lots of wind, and they just couldn't live anywhere like that. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have enough food. They complained. They were upset. We need to find a place where we could live. Where can we go? Well, they knew of a civilization far to the south, across the desert. And if they stayed along an old trading pathway, they'd find their way to this new place where they could get food and water. It was a matter of survival. But getting through the desert, that was a matter of survival too. They had to listen to their leaders. They had to work together. They had to find their way when there were storms of wind but no rain. And what happened was, as they walked, life was just terrible. They would stop and gather and talk together and try to work as a community. And they weren't sure all the time of where they were going, but they kept going and they kept moving. And they went this way, all the way to the south, further and further and further. And they looked to the horizon and there just was more desert, little food, and some began to fall by the wayside, but others picked them up. And soon they saw something green, which meant that something could grow. And sure enough, they saw that it was the civilization. It was the place called Egypt. And the king of Egypt was called the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh welcomed them. You are travelers from far away. I will give you food. I will give you water. And they were happy, but not for long. They had food and they had water, but the Pharaoh was very, very, very harsh. He said he embraced them, but he really didn't. They were never accepted. He made them get up in the morning when he told them to get up. He told them what work they had to do, and they had to do it. And some of the work was very hard. He told them what they could eat and when they could eat. Sometimes it wasn't very much. He told them when they would go to sleep. He told them who they should honor, not their God. The Pharaoh, that's who they should honor. And so everything about this place began to become very difficult. And soon, people looked at their leader, Moses, and they said, we need to go home. We're fed now. We can journey through the desert back the way we came, but we need to leave. We can't stay here with all this. And so Moses went to the Pharaoh. And he said, Pharaoh, my people wish to return to their homeland. Please, let my people go. And the Pharaoh looked at him and said, no, you will stay here forever, all of you. Oh my goodness me. What was Moses going to do? So Moses prayed to God. And things began to happen in Egypt. And there was a plague about this, and there was a plague about that, and there were very difficult times. And every time one of those plagues came around, Moses came to the Pharaoh and said, please, let my people go. And the Pharaoh said, no, you will stay here, even though he was concerned about why all these things were happening. And then one day an angel of death was sent by the Lord and coursed through the whole of the civilized area. And every single oldest male child of every family passed away that night, except for all of the chosen people's families. What they did, what they were told to do, was to sacrifice a lamb, and with the blood of the lamb to mark their homes on their doors with the blood of that lamb. And the angel of death would pass over them, and all were safe. Even the Pharaoh's son passed away, was not protected. And now Moses went to the Pharaoh and said, "Please, let my people go." And this time the Pharaoh said, "Well, all right, be gone with you and your terrible things, your plague and this, and just leave, and leave soon before I change my mind. Go!" And so Moses quickly told everyone, "We must go, we must quickly gather everything together." And so they did. They gathered together whatever flour they had, whatever water they had, and they quickly made bread. But bread has to have leaven. It has to rise to be soft. Like we have yeast and baking powder today, they had the same kind of leaven, but they didn't have time. They had to gather things together so quick that they made this bread that was very hard and it didn't rise at all, but it was food. And that's what they would need to sustain their journey back to their homeland. And so they organized together, and Moses led them and says, "Please, we must leave soon." And so they gathered their families, they gathered whatever belongings they could, and they quickly made their way back toward where their homeland was. But now they were leaving from a different place. And there was a shortcut that they knew, but there was a problem. Because as they got closer and closer through the desert with lots of terrible hardships, they ran into a barrier. A barrier is something that makes it difficult to cross. Yes, it was, yeah, you got it, it was water. Was it a river? No, the Nile River was behind me. That was where the civilization was. That's where the Pharaoh lived. This was an arm of what we know today is the Red Sea. And they stopped at the barrier. "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And Moses climbed up on a rock and asked God to please let us know how we can get across. And then they heard it, the rumble, the shouts from behind him. The Pharaoh had changed his mind and was coming after them. And people screamed and they worried. And one tried to go in the water himself. He made it all the way up to the water to his waist and then all the way up to his chin. "He's not going to save us." And many of them, their faith was tried. And Moses looked up to God and says, "Let my people go." And sure enough, a miracle happened. Oh, the waters began to move back. Bit by bit, they moved back until there was a pathway right through the water. Quickly, quickly across. And so they made their way as fast as they could. One at a time, two at a time, five at a time, whole groups at a time. Quickly, quickly, quickly. They could hear the shouts of the Pharaoh. "What's going to happen? They're going to follow us in." But when the last of them made it across, all of a sudden, the waters flowed back. And oh yes, some of the Pharaoh's men were caught, but the Pharaoh could not get through now because the water was blocking the way. It was deep. And of course, the Pharaoh couldn't understand what had happened. Well, there they were, safe from the Pharaoh. Freedom was theirs. And so they celebrated. They danced and they sang. And one called Miriam, why she said, "Break out the bread, break out the bread." And so they brought out the bread. And they gave a piece to every single person there in the gathering. But don't touch the bread yet. Don't eat it until everyone has some to make sure we have enough. And because they were thrifty, they had enough. And every single one of them had the bread in their hands. And Miriam said, "Let us give thanks. Let us give thanks of the Passover, that we were definitely spared. And let us give thanks, to God for getting us through and away from that terrible place." And so they sang and they danced and they celebrated. But even as they celebrated, they looked ahead and they had that long, long desert to cross to get back to their homeland. That's another story. But for now, it's important to remember a celebration that, happens every year. Every year, this Passover is celebrated, people gather together and they break out the matzah bread, the same kind of bread that the chosen people used a long time ago. And they pass it around to everyone there, and they celebrate the Passover with lots of matzah bread, lots of celebration, lots of stories about God and freedom and the journeys that took them back to the homeland. So that's our story. What do you think? What do you think was the most important part of this story, huh? What moved you the most? What did you like the best? Oh, the water changing? Oh, the mean Pharaoh? Moses? Maybe, maybe their faith in God sorely tested, but they remembered. Yes, the matzah bread, of course. And we all are eating the matzah bread, aren't we? You bet we are. Yeah. Well, think of yourself in this story. Think of what you would do. Would you have had faith? What if you saw the Red Sea in front of you? What would you do? What would you think? Who would you pray to? And thank goodness that you have a good leader. What do you think of Moses? Yeah. So there's a lot to remember in this story. There's a lot to think about. And there's a lot to pass on. And there's also a lot to come in the days ahead for the chosen people. This was their exodus. And that's our story.